Okay, we can begin. All right, so Kristys Hollingshead Seitz is here from Department of Defense. She's working there. She's a computational linguist who is working in the area of deep language understanding and also across large collections of texts. She is looking at combining evidence, probabilistic knowledge bases, and change point detection and sentiment analysis. So it's a nice broad spectrum. But prior to her current position, she was actually my next door neighbor at the University of Maryland while I was there. She was a postdoctoral researcher there in the department with Philip Resnick working on machine translation pipelines. She received her PhD in 2010. There it is. From OHSU, which I can now just say it because it's up there, and in computer science. And she also has research interests in natural language processing that touch on language modeling and automated clinical diagnostics. And so the title of her talk today is Multimodal Indicators Quantifying Mental Health Signals. I'm very excited about this. And with that, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to talk about this work. This work is it'll come in two parts, and I'll talk about that when I get to the outline, but it's part of what I did at the very end of my graduate career at OHSU, and then so that was 4 years ago. Time flies. And then something that's been sort of picking up steam and interest in the community over the last year. And so I've been taking some of my free time to work on some of the other work that I'll talk about at the end that I'm really excited to talk about. So I have a lot of collaborators that I need to thank for their efforts on this work and working with me. Brian Work, who is my supervisor at my grad school and is now at Google. Meg Mitchell, who was with me in grad school and is now at Microsoft Research. Glenn Coppersmith, Mark Dredzy, and Craig Harmon, who are all at the JHU Human Language Technology Center of Excellence, who I interact with regularly, and a couple of others. The papers, I've listed 3 papers here at the bottom because there's a lot of work that I'm talking about today, and there's a lot of details that I'm skipping over just in the interest of getting done in time. Definitely feel free to ask me if you have any questions. Feel free to read the papers and then let me or any of the other authors know if you have any questions. I have something like 50 hidden slides, so there's a lot of detail, but a huge portion of it is in the papers, so those are listed there. I have 4 takeaways for you all today. The first is that quantifiable, multimodal signals of mental health do exist for several different mental illnesses, and I'll be talking specifically about the first stages of Alzheimer's, which is called mild cognitive impairment, MCI, PTSD, depression, SAD, seasonal affective disorder, and bipolar disorders. The quantifiability, if I may, these signals make automated assessments possible. So I'll be sort of coming back to that over and over throughout the talk. And for some mental illnesses, and we'll talk about which ones, we can gather and validate big data quickly and cheaply. And I'll talk about what I mean by big, because that's sort of a buzzword. So I'm buzzword compliant now, right? But I think that even still our notion of big is just starting to get there. And then finally, these automated assessments that I'll be talking about, that this quantifiable cheap data enables, these assessments don't replace, but rather assist clinicians in making diagnoses and treating and interacting with their patients. All right, so I'll start with motivation, and then I'll talk about the MCI study that we did when I was in grad school. And then I'll talk a little bit about mental health in social media that we've been looking at over the last year or so. So mental health assessment is hard for a couple of reasons. There are some sort of established standard tests that are run, but don't quite capture everything that might present itself. Furthermore, the mental illnesses that are captured by these tests, by the mini mental state examination and the diagnostic statistical manual, which is not a test, I suppose, but rather a description. The mental illnesses are very different, and yet they're trying to be captured in these, static ways. And what we're trying to find are often symptoms and not actually causes. And then the measures, importantly, are often subjective and manual. A lot of the data is interview data, where it's either self or other reported. So maybe a patient is visiting a clinician maybe once a week, certainly not every hour, something very regular. Or maybe the reports are coming from the clinician herself, or maybe from family members. And I'll talk about that a little bit right at the end. This interview data might have a reporting bias. So if a family member is providing a report about current status, maybe they really want to, they've made their decision already, so they're going to report things that they think support their own opinion. There's a hindsight bias. Oh, this person turned out to exhibit all these symptoms. Surely I'd been seeing it for the last several months. And it's slow to gather samples. Like I said, it's maybe once a week. It's probably much less frequent than that, up to twice a year. And that can really sort of slow down the process, and it leads to small data rather than the big data that we're interested in looking at. There's also a societal stigma on all of these mental illnesses. And so I'll talk about a couple of ways that I want to look at that. So first is I am trying to, with this work, remove the subjectivity and the manual nature of some of these measures by providing objective, quantifiable, automated measures, which, again, don't replace the existing measures, but provide another signal, another bit of information that can be taken into account. And then by looking at social media, we actually are able to remove maybe a lot of this bias, and we're able to speed up the rate at which we can gather samples of data. I've put a sort of dotted line through societal stigma, and we can talk about that maybe more when I get to that particular set of experiments. But because of the anonymity that's available in social media, you can often have multiple accounts. Maybe they're not specifically associated with you or your name or anything that can actually tie you back to you. People might, I hypothesize, feel more free to talk about their illnesses online, where they have that anonymous curtain. So mental illness, it's a burden on society, and so a lot of what I think is great about this work is that it has the potential to affect and to improve our society. It's the second leading cause of disability and premature death. The estimated economic burden to Canada is $51 billion. That's a lot. And it affects a significant percentage of the U.S. adult population every year. So depression affects 6.7% of U.S. adults every year. PTSD is about half that, 3.5%. And Alzheimer's is 11% of those over 65. So I'm going to start talking about the MCI study that we conducted a couple of years ago. So MCI, it's a neurodegenerative syndrome, which often involves some sort of memory deficit. It is the earliest detectable phase of dementia or Alzheimer's. And a group of individuals that have been diagnosed as having MCI are significantly more likely to progress into full dementia than a group that has not been diagnosed as having MCI. But some in that group may remain stable for years. A few may return to normal. The scale that we'll use to determine whether that has been used to determine whether somebody has a mild cognitive impairment or not is called the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale. It's a widely used standard. It scores the severity of dementia from mild to severe. And MCI, mild cognitive impairment, was added later. So that has a score of 0.5. And I'll constantly come back to that 0.5 versus a score of 0, which is what we'll be comparing in the data. These scores are assigned based on a clinical interview and examination. I should also note throughout that although today I'm talking specifically about MCI or Alzheimer's, and then the others that I listed, I think that sort of the basic idea here is valuable for potentially many other types of disorders. And so please try to sort of keep a general mind if you're not particularly interested in Alzheimer's or whatever. So in order to determine the whether or not somebody has dementia, they'll run a series of tests or a battery of tests. We had a set of subjects that had been tested every 6 months. So as I said, it's not very frequently, where they were trying to understand the transition from healthy elderly to Alzheimer's-related dementia. And they were particularly interested in that condition of mild cognitive impairment because it could be maintained for several years and because some of the patients would return to normal. These batteries are about 2 hours long, and there are lots of tests, including a digit span, where you're given a digit and you have to read it forwards and backwards and then repeat it without seeing it. Category fluency, so can you list 10 animals? Can you list an animal for every letter of the alphabet? These are sort of fun to, of course, we all tried these on ourselves, right? So I'm terrible at animals, but better at vegetables, which means nothing, I promise. We also, there's also this test called the linguistic memory test, which is a word list and narrative. And I have a little star by that narrative because that's the data that we really focused on for this study. And then, as I said, the CDR is assessed independently of these battery of tests. So it's just based on interviewing with the clinician and the patient. So the linguistic markers, which were what we were interested in because we're natural language processing people at my particular center of research at OHSU. They had determined that these linguistic memory tests, which unfortunately get shortened to LM, which can be confusable with language model. So the linguistic memory tests are most effective for detecting mild cognitive impairment. There are a couple of tests. The one that we focus on is the logical memory test, which I'll give an example of in a second. The scoring is done in real time. I think I hid that slide, but I could show you what the scoring sheet looks like. So the scoring, because it's done in real time, it's very simple. It's just, did this person mention a name? Did they mention this particular aspect of the story? There's other information from those tests that we felt might have diagnostic utility. So for example, of the words that are recalled, are they from the beginning of the narrative? Are they from the end? Are they the nouns? Are they the verbs? What's happening? Similarly, if you're given a word list, is it from the beginning? Is it from the end? We also looked at spoken language characteristics. So these narrative recall tests are recorded. So you can look at how many pauses there are within a retelling, how long those pauses are, whether they're filled, whether the clinician has to really encourage the patient to go ahead and continue with their retelling of the story. And so we wanted to look at whether we could perhaps provide an automated administration of this type of test to, as I said earlier, provide extra information to a clinician. We're not taking over their job. They have an important and difficult job. But we wanted to see whether we could add some extra information there to maybe to filter the the very obvious ends of the scale, so either very strongly in dementia or very obviously nowhere near. Or just to provide that extra bit of this weird machine thinks that this person should be looked at. Take an extra look. Look at this, look at that, just look again. So I said I'd provide an example of the logical memory test. So a short narrative is told to the subject, Anna Thompson of South Boston, employed as a cook in a school cafeteria. And then a patient is asked to immediately retell the story. So the clinician will read all the way through the story and then ask the patient to repeat it. And then after a delay of about 30 minutes or so, the patient's asked to tell it again. So here's what an immediate retelling might look like. You can see it's fairly true to the story, actually. And then after 30 minutes, this is what it looks like, where it says, the lady worked in a school. She had, oh, it's really impossible. She went to the police because she'd been robbed. And so you can see that it's much shorter than the first retelling, but it still is capturing a number of elements of the narrative. And I think that actually this narrative retelling is from somebody who is a healthy elderly. So this is what it looks like when somebody does not have mild cognitive impairment. And I don't have an example from somebody who does. Sorry. I think we might have such in the paper, though. So the scoring procedures, as I mentioned earlier, are manual. So both the immediate and those delayed retellings are scored for recall. So there are 25 story units that are defined for this narrative. This narrative is the same. This is not somebody making up a story and asking you to repeat it. It's Anna Thompson of South Boston. And we get good at retelling the story as well. And there are clear guidelines about what counts or doesn't for any of the given story units for that recall count. Then the subject score is just a sum of the recalled story units. That scoring is done in real time by the administrating clinician, so you might think that perhaps we computer scientists could help with counting. So that was the first sort of, we could help with that at least, just summing up. But we also wondered maybe if we could start trying to figure out whether those story units were present. So we looked at that and a couple of other features. These recall scores have been shown to be good predictors of mild cognitive impairment, which is why we're looking at maybe how to capture them. So we looked at a couple of linguistic classification features in order to determine automatically from a recorded narrative retelling whether a patient is likely to have MCI. A lot of the features, I think all of the features that I'll talk about the study today are syntactic features. So some sentences are harder to process than others. So for example, the administrator, who the intern, who the nurse supervised, had bothered, lost the medical reports, which is sort of famously, sentences like that are famously difficult because of center embedding. So this is the same sentence where we've removed the center embedding by replacing it with who. So the intern, who the nurse supervised, had bothered the administrator, who lost the medical reports. That's much easier, right? Who got it the first time around? Who's good at yeah, Bonnie. You're used to reading center embedded sentences. Yeah. Well, wait. I know, I know. I started practicing at them too, and it's not a good talent to have. It's not very marketable, but it's a fun party trick. So both sentences are grammatical, as Bonnie confirmed for us. It's perfectly reasonable to say it with the center embedding.
Just don't do that.
And it means the same thing. Don't do it. You'll confuse all your friends. Or do it. It's a party trick. But there's something in the syntactic structure, and there's a typo on my slide, that makes the first sentence more difficult, which is the center embedding. So we're going to try and go after this sense of complexity. What makes this sentence so much harder to process in terms of syntactic complexity, motivated by the fact that that's associated with processing demands or memory demands. And we hypothesized that people who are having issues with memory might therefore also be having issues with processing things that are difficult with a high cognitive load. We also looked at spoken language features, in particular, so I think I mentioned pause-related features, and I'm not going to talk about that at all today, but it's in the paper, and I would, of course, be happy to talk about it in a one-on-one session if anybody's interested, or you can always email me. So there are actually a lot of ways of measuring syntactic complexity that we looked at. This is one of the points where I have about 5 hidden slides. So I'm just going to give you a high-level overview because I want to get to the newer work. I think it's a little more interesting. But just to give you a sense of what we looked at, there's a fairly established set of ways to measure syntactic complexity, including mean length of utterance. So if you, for example, examine the length of my sentences, they're very long because I go on and on. But a shorter sentence is easier to process. We also looked at developmental level or D-level complexity scores, which we go into more in the paper. It's an established complexity measure, as well as developmental complexity. And finally, the index of productive syntax, IPSYN. More interestingly, we looked at a variety of scoring parse trees. I come from a parsing background, so that was a lot of fun for parsing to actually have importance and be representing something that could be measured and that was indicative of something. So we looked at INGV scoring, which is based on the stack size of the parse tree, where it's sort of measuring the tree shape. Is it really bushy? Is it really long and lengthy? Is it just a single sentence that goes out to the right? Fraser scoring is very similar in that it's looking at a syntactic constituency tree, like the INGV scoring metric, but it has different weights for different constituents, where you get extra scores for creating complex phrases within the center of the sentence. We also looked at sort of simpler things like the number of nodes in the tree per word. So if you're building up a very deep tree, then maybe it's more complex. We also looked at dependency trees, measuring the mean distance between dependencies, and part-of-speech tag cross-entropy. And if you have any questions about any of those, I'd be happy to talk about it. But I just want to go on to show you how those features we were able to use them to measure whether patients had MCI. So this is the data that we were working with. We had 74 subjects, which were grouped by clinical dementia rating, CDR, as I mentioned. We selected these subjects to have an even set of healthy elderly, and so half of them were healthy elderly, had a CDR rating of 0, and half of them had MCI, a CDR rating of 0.5, where, again, CDR greater than 1 is somebody who has dementia. So we don't actually have any patients with dementia in this study. We're just looking at healthy versus MCI, which is a fairly subtle difference, actually. The recordings of the retold narratives were transcribed and syntactically annotated, and then we went back and did both of those steps automatically as well. So we ran automatic speech recognition on the recordings, and then parsed the output of the ASR with the Charniak parser. So I said that there was a battery of tests that are run to determine whether somebody has MCI or not, or dementia. And just to sort of demonstrate that some of these are indeed really good at pulling apart subjects. This is a sort of busy graph of what those features look like and how well they do on our particular data set. So age is really terrible at predicting MCI because it had nothing to do with anything. Education is also not at all very good at predicting MCI, so that was great to see. We didn't want to sort of, oh, well, if they're 2 years older, then of course they have MCI. So we wanted to ensure that that was not the case, and indeed that's what we're seeing here. The mini mental state exam is very good at separating the two groups. And then you can see sort of in the middle the logical memory 1 and 2 for the immediate and delayed retellings. So there are some significant group differences for some speech and linguistic measures. So you saw that the manual recall-based metrics were able to separate the groups. That's good because in NLP we're always running imperfect analytics. So if the human doing it couldn't separate the groups using that information, then we wouldn't have expected our own noisier, more errorful analytics to be able to do so. So that's we were happy to see that that was there. There were some significant differences for immediate and not delayed recall, and vice versa. So each of those two tests, it turns out, are necessary and important for distinguishing the two groups, healthy and MCI. These significant differences in our study held up with automation, so that was great too. We were worried that as soon as we threw ASR or Ternary parser at it, everything would just fall apart. We'd have to go back to the beginning where we were relying on human annotators to transcribe and syntactically annotate the retellings, which is even more time consuming than where we started, so that would have been terrible. Some of the significant features that we found were words per clause, and that held up for both immediate and delayed recall retellings. The INGV and the dependency length metrics, which only showed up in the delayed recall. You can see that Fraser's not on there. Not super sure why. Maybe because we had all sorts of conjectures, but maybe because we did have the oldest group of elderly subjects that sort of have ever been put through this long range of tests. And we gathered the data over years and years. So as you may or may not be aware, people as they grow older tend to have shorter, simpler sentences. And so maybe the Fraser metric was just capturing the longer, more complex sentences, and they just weren't there in the group at all. Who knows? The part of speech tag cross-entropy was also important, but only in terms of the immediate recall retelling, as well as the content density, where we were looking at sort of content words. So if you say and the a lot, then you don't get as many points as if you say Anna and Thompson and police and robbed and money and children. So the classifier method that we did, and you'll see this again in the second study, is leave pair out. And we used ROC curves to evaluate the classifiers, which plots the true positive rate versus the false positive rate. We can calculate the area under the curve. For this particular set of data, I'm just reporting area under the curve. For the second set, for the second study, I'll show the actual ROC curves and discuss a little bit about what it means if you at a particular area of the graph. We'll get there. So the area under the curve is going to tell us the probability that a randomly chosen positive example would be ranked higher than a negative example. So the probability that one of the MCI patients would be ranked higher than a healthy subject would be ranked. So those are the pairs that we're leaving out, is always a patient with MCI and a healthy patient. So we did run a bunch of trials. So you might imagine how long 1,300 trials would take to score manually. And so that's part of the power, right, of being able to do natural language processing, is this ability to run a lot of data. So some of the numbers that we report, if we look at just the logical memory 1 versus 2 scores, then our area under the curve is almost 75%. So we're about 3/4 right, where random would be 50% because we had a balanced set. If we look at just some of the linguistic features, so these are the syntactic features that I talked about, then that number goes down actually, because as I said, these analytics are noisy, they're errorful, they can make an error, but they're pretty close. If we add in speech features, we do even worse. And if we add in all of the linguistic and speech features, we continue going down, where up is better, okay? So that was concerning for a little bit. But then we looked at what if we use the logical memory scores that are provided plus some of the automated linguistic features. So now we're using the clinician and the analytics together, better together. And you can see that indeed the number is going up. We're now above the manual rating score. We also looked at what if you just take into account the logical memory scores plus all of the other neural psychological test scores. So we'll call that all test. And that gets very good at 80%. But again, yay, we can get a boost above that by adding some of our selected linguistic features and even higher above that once we add in the speech features as well. So we can do a bit better. We can help with these analytics to perform these classifications of patients that are presenting with potentially MCI or not. Okay, so there is information, as we showed, in that spoken language sample that's useful for screening. We can automate the feature extraction from a transcript or audio, which is good news, so that we don't have a bunch of annotators sitting around transcribing narrative recall tests. It is really fun to transcribe those, but painful. And there was in order to sort of derive the best features, we needed a complementary set of features. So we did best when we considered both syntax and speech together. So that shows us that there are quantifiable and multimodal signals of mental health. And these quantifiable signals could potentially make some version of automated assessments possible. It's certainly not as good as the clinicians themselves, so that's actually good, I think. But it provides additional information that could be used to help if we put them together. So that's the end of the MCI study. I'm going to move on to the mental health in social media study, which is a little bit newer and looks a little bit more at sort of what I would actually consider to be big data. There's been a lot of work in this area in the past couple of years. It's starting to gain a lot of traction. There was a position paper called Role of Social Media in Mental Health by Deschaudery in 2013. And if you're going to read one paper on how to look at mental health and social media, that's the one. Read it. It's great. But she really focuses, and for good reason, on classifying depression, both in a population and in individuals. So for example, postpartum depression, she determined could be discovered based on people's tweets, etc. But there are a couple drawbacks we felt of this prior work, where she was using a crowdsourced survey to rate somebody on the CESD, the depression scale. And if they scored highly on the depression scale, then she asked if she could have access to their Twitter feed. So they were then aware that she was collecting their Twitter feed. And she, in the study, then had 117 positive depression users. We'll come back to that number a little bit. One other drawback is this focus on depression, which is, it's common, but I think in part because it has a lifetime prevalence rate. 16% of people will experience major depression over the course of their lives, versus some of the other disorders that we were looking at. So bipolar, which we'll come back to, PTSD, which is only 7%, schizophrenia, which is down at 1%. And we felt that her methods wouldn't necessarily apply to a smaller population like that if we tried to go after something like bipolar or PTSD, which we had particular interest in doing. So what we did, we really lucked out, actually. One of my collaborators, Mark Dredzy, had been collecting tweets from the Twitter, I think, fire hose, with health-related keywords, where the keywords he was searching on included fever, cough, nausea, sickness, and importantly, diagnosed. He'd been doing this since 2011. It's about 8 million tweets a day, and about 1.5 gigabytes a day. And we looked at some of those diagnosed with whatever, and I'll give an example, tweets, and there are about 100 of those, so 1 million in total, or about 30K a day. So it's much smaller than the data set that Mark was looking at, but it's this long range of data that we just happen to have sitting around and have access to. So this is why it was important that he was querying on diagnosis, or diagnose. There's a regular expression search on it. So some of the examples that had been pulled back that he was just ignoring, actually, because he was looking for health epidemics. So can you watch flu spread across the country? Some other things like that. So some of the tweets that came back that had been tagged with diagnose are, so today I started therapy. She diagnosed me with anorexia, depression, anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and wants me to blah, blah, blah. People will tell you anything on Twitter. It's amazing. Also, people are funny on Twitter, and I'll come back to that. I wanted to share some things that have been helping me heal lately. I was diagnosed with severe complex PTSD and blah, blah, blah. So we went and polled all of these diagnosed tweets. We asserted that they're a genuine diagnosis. 3 of us, Craig, Glenn, and I, all read through a large number of these tweets and determined whether or not we felt that it was a genuine diagnosis. Because people can be funny on Twitter, or try to be. So some of the disorders in particular, bipolar, people will joke that the weather is being bipolar. So that's not a genuine diagnosis. People will say that their brother diagnosed them with having SAD today for whatever reason, or work has given them PTSD, not genuine diagnoses. So we went through those. We ensured that we had at least 25 tweets from each user. This is a very user-based study, so we're trying to find somebody who has this disorder, who has PTSD, who has bipolar disorder. And we required that at least 75% of their tweets were in English, as determined automatically by the Google Compact Language Detector. So this is sort of an elbow analysis, just to get rid of sort of a lot of the crap. But we did come up with a decent number of match conditions. So for the 4 that we were looking at, bipolar, depression, PTSD, and SAD, we matched on, so you can look at 5,800 for bipolar, genuine diagnoses, those are tweets, and then that boils down to 400 users. The match is the diagnosis tweet. And then we went and pulled all of those tweets from that user that we had over the collection. So we, because we had that historical data, we could go back and get it and run an analysis across time. You'll be unsurprised to learn that mental disorders change over time. So somebody in particular, SAD, it's been, Moon Jashadri showed that SAD was sort of coming in waves with the seasons, We have not actually seen that in our data collection, which we found odd, but there's a potential reason for it. The numbers to the right that you see are the numbers of users that have both diagnosed statements. So there's a lot of comorbidity between all of these conditions, except for SAD. So for example, we had 19 users that had been diagnosed as being both bipolar and depressed. And we had 2 users that were diagnosed as being bipolar and depressed and having PTSD. These come out a lot together, and it's actually not surprising once you think about it a bit. And we could see it also in the feature set that we were pulling out. Oh, these features for this class do really overlap with each other. That's interesting. I put up 2 asterisks here. Maybe? Nah. At depression, it says that we found 441 users, and I'm lying to you because we got tired after looking at 441 users because it was a lot of data, and we decided that was enough data to probably go forward with, so we moved on to some of the other conditions. We probably could have doubled that number based on what we had collected. As I said, it's a really common disorder. SAD, we did a really terrible job of distinguishing between seasonal affective disorder, which is what we meant to be going after, and social anxiety disorder. And you can see that we didn't have anybody experiencing comorbidity with SAD and all the other 3, and we're not sure if that's because of how poorly we distinguished between seasonal affective disorder and social anxiety disorder, or for some other reason. Maybe people tend to be either depressed or have SAD, but not both. I don't know. We also pulled back 5,700 control users, where these are just users where we had at least 25 of their tweets over the last 3 years, and 75% of those tweets were English. So we are going to assume that nobody in that control set has any of these conditions. That's obviously untrue, and I'll talk a little bit about why that's okay anyways. These 441 users, which as I said is about half of what we probably could have found, compare that to the 117 users that Deshadri found in her study, and I think that we're starting to look at what could be considered big data. So this is one of the takeaways, that for some mental illnesses, like the 4 that I showed previously, we can gather and validate big data quickly and cheaply. This was actually free to us because it had already been paid for off of another study, and it was really quick to go through and pull down those users. We've now started pulling our own fire hose with diagnosed tweets, and so we're sort of expanding that data set. And in fact, I'll mention it now, it's a little bit out of time. In fact, we will be having a hackathon workshop in October on this data, and we're going to release half of it to anybody who wants to participate in this unshared task. So that'll be really fun. Looking forward to it. All right. So just as with the MCI study, we looked at linguistic and also multimodal classification features to determine whether somebody had a mental illness or not, was likely to be part of our control group. So a couple of the features that we looked at, a really classic one is the linguistic inquiry word count. I never say it all the way out. LIWC, L-I-W-C. Where these are lexicons that have associated psychological meaning. So maybe words associated with trauma or first, second, and third person pronouns. This is a data set that has been established by psychologists and worked over for years. It is only in English. There is also a Spanish data set of LIWC terms, but that's it. There are no other languages that have been established in this way. It's traditionally used to analyze patient writing. So this person uses a lot of words related to death. or there was the discovery that depressed patients use the first person pronoun more than control patients do. So the set of words that we looked at were first person pronoun, second, third, swearing, anger, positive emotion, negative emotion, anxiety, and dysfunction words. We also looked at sentiment analysis, where this is absolutely snake oil sentiment analysis. We are not doing any of the smart things that are out there right now. We're really just, we took a lexicon of sentiment-bearing words. It's a large lexicon, and it's been, it's from Meg Mitchell and Ben Vandermee, also at the COE. But they're sort of just words that you might expect to be happy, or be sentiment-bearing, like happy, joyful, sweet, celebrate. And they all have a weight of how positive or negative they are. And it's always positive or negative, and it's not targeted sentiment, it's just general, this tweet is showing happy emotion. We weighted each tweet by a subjectivity score, and the tweets were scored by just summing the weights associated with the words in the lexicon, and if the total across the tweet was positive, then we said that that was a positive sentiment tweet. If it was 0, so maybe I said, I'm happy that my bitter stepmom is visiting today, then it would cancel each other out and they'd be neutral. And finally, if it was less than 0, then it'd be classified as a negative sentiment tweet. And we looked at the proportion of positive tweets and negative tweets per user, because again, this is a user-based study. We don't particularly care about whether I can find a tweet that is like, this is the classic depression tweet. I care about whether I can classify a user as a whole based on their language, their words. We also looked at a unigram language model. So this is just a bag of words. We're just classifying according to features that are based on single words, where we're doing white space tokenization, nothing smart. We did limit ourselves to English for this study, and we are very interested in looking at other languages in the future. It's discriminatively trained, so we always had a classifier that was training either on a mental disorder versus the control. And there's always one label per user. And importantly, we removed the tweets that said, I've been diagnosed with PTSD and depression and bipolar. So we couldn't cheat in that way. This is a very open vocabulary approach versus the Luke categories, where we're really just, whatever word is in there, we're throwing it into the classifier, and we're going to find out if anything comes out. Similarly, we looked at a character n-gram language model, a sliding window of 5 character n-grams, which can compensate for some spelling errors. It also captures some writing peculiarities, which you might know happens a lot on Twitter because people are creative and emphatic in their writing and use different ways to try to express that emphasis. And then we looked at the probability that it was generated either by somebody with PTSD or a random user. And again, this is an open vocabulary approach. Now, I said that we weren't really interested in finding like the classic depressed tweet, but there are some examples here just to give you an idea of what scores really high on the different features. So for example, for I think the anger one is a little bit interesting because you can, maybe you can think to yourself that this is angry-ish, but there's a lot of spelling errors in there or abbreviations, but it still is going to score high on anger. In general, though, I think that we want to look at sort of the aggregation across the user. So the first thing that we did was we did the Luke analysis, where we looked at the proportion of tweets with positive scores in the Luke categories. So again, that's first, second, and third person pronoun, swearing, anger words, positive and negative emotion, and anxiety words. And we're always going to look at whether we can classify somebody with bipolar disease against a control. We replicated a number of previous findings for depression. We have a couple of novel results for depression, And then these are the very first results that have ever been reported, as far as we are aware, for bipolar, PTSD, and SAD in social media. I have a quick diagram. I don't know if you guys are familiar with notched box and whisker plot diagrams. I was not, I had to be taught. So just, it gives you a way to look quickly and see whether or not something is statistically significantly different. So this is a notch. If the notches do not overlap at all, then those two sets are statistically significantly different. If there is any overlap between the notches, then they're not statistically significant different. And then we looked at the different categories. Can you guys see that okay on the projector? Okay. We looked at the different categories of Luke words or categories for each of our 4 conditions plus the control or random. So PTSD is in purple, depression in blue, SAD in yellow, bipolar in red, and random in gray. And so you can see that there are a couple of cases where each of the different conditions are indeed very different from random and very different from each other. One thing of note is that this last bar on the right, the whole set is anxiety, and it's on a different scale because it turns out that anxiety is just very, I don't know, it's very sensitive. We saw everything just smushed down at the bottom, but once we blew it up, you could see that there were, in fact, statistically significant differences. So we replicated some of the work from Moon to Chaudhry, so that was exciting, where the stars along the top tell you whether or not something is statistically significantly different. In case you can't see the little notched overlaps, don't worry, we measured it actually with math and stuff. Where we replicated the result that PTSD is statistically significantly different from random in terms of how often they use the first person pronoun. So that's the star all the way over on the left. Under positive emotions, so sort of in the middle of those 3, we did not find a statistically significant difference with depression, people who are depressed versus a random user, and that's supported by several other studies. We did not, versus Moon to Chaudhry, find a significant difference in the use of the third person pronoun. So, okay, but 4 out of 5 is not bad. We also found that all of the differences in the use of anxiety words were different across all of the groups. So that was pretty interesting as well. So all of the groups. So that was pretty interesting as well. So with this study, we showed that differences in language between users that have these different conditions, it does exist. They're using language differently. So that's sort of exciting. It was also nice to be able to validate our data. We sort of were like, I don't know, what if we just grep for these diagnosed, like, are people lying? I don't know, let's look into it. And based on the fact that we were able to replicate so many of the previous findings, we feel that this is a valid way to gather big data quickly and cheaply, and we validated it. So multimodal is in the title of my talk, and I think that it's, there are probably a couple of different interpretations of multimodal, but here I really, in this study, we focused on, in addition to just language, we looked at pattern of life. So can you determine whether somebody is socially engaged? And we were measuring that by their tweet rate, the number or proportion of @ mentions and self-@ mentions, as well as the unique users that were mentioned. Social engagement has been shown to improve depression and some of the other disorders. We also looked at insomnia, what time of day locally were people tweeting, and how normal was that to their own selves. So I have a Twitter account. I have 2 actually, it's kind of embarrassing. But I always tweet really late at night. I'll tweet at like 10, 11, midnight. And that's totally normal for me. So we didn't want something to say, oh my gosh, this person has insomnia. She keeps tweeting at midnight. Not true, it's normalized across the user. We also wanted to examine exercise. This is also my fault because I use Daily Mile and it's connected to my Twitter account. And so it will say, Kristy ran 5 miles today and felt great. If I pick the little feel great smile. And so we looked, exercise has been shown to improve some of these mental illnesses. And so we sort of tried to go after whether we could find that information. But it turns out that there are not so many people using Daily Mile as I do. So we're going to look at whether we can separate users. Sort of in the same way, we're going to leave 2 out, do a cross-fold validation, and here's where we'll look at the ROC curves, where we took the unigram language model and the character language model that are trained on the remaining users as text. And then we try to classify, can we determine somebody who has bipolar versus a random user? We trained a log linear model using a couple of these scores, including insomnia and social engagement. And so you can see that, okay, so here's the full curve. So up and to the left is better. Okay, the dotted line along the middle, that's a random chance. So if the closer you are to that line, the closer you are to just randomly guessing. And if you're below that line, then you should flip your classifier on its head and use that information instead. So you can see, the yellow shows up much better. Good. You can see how we did on each of the 4 conditions. We're actually best able to classify PTSD versus random users. And then bipolar, and then depression, and then SAD. SAD is the worst, and that's pretty consistent, sort of whatever set of features we threw at it. And eventually we started to think that maybe it was because of the seasonal affective versus social anxiety. We also wanted to look at how each of the features did. So was it really the Luke categories, which has been very popular in trying to classify users? Was it the language models? Was it the pattern of life? You can see the yellow. And I'll zoom in a little bit on that and show some of the conclusions. So in all cases, we were able to do better than chance. Yay! Or we wouldn't have written a paper. So you can see that we do better on some groups than others. SAD is the worst. If you look at the blue and yellow, so yellow is for pattern of life, blue is for the Luke categories. They're about on par, and they're the worst performing. And they will flip back and forth a little bit. It's a little bit hard to see the yellow, I'm sorry. Where sometimes pattern of life does a little better than the Luke category, except in the case of depression, where the Luke categories did best, which maybe unsurprisingly is why everybody's been using Luke to classify depressed users. The language models, though, are doing much better than any of the other features, and so maybe there's really something to this sort of open vocabulary. Let's just look at what they're writing. How are they writing it? What are they saying? Approach. So that's our recommendation. So again, these are multimodal signals that make automated assessments possible. We did one more step of validation, which I'm going to skip, but just it's a further experiment that demonstrated that yes, indeed, this data is believable. I'm happy to talk about it anytime. So these are our 4 takeaways: that we are able to quantify multimodal signals and use those signals to make automated assessments quickly and cheaply on big data for some mental illnesses, and that these automated assessments do not replace, but instead could be used to assist diagnostic clinicians. So what now? I have a lot of questions on this slide, so I think that there's sort of an ethical responsibility now. If we detect a high-scoring random user, which we did a couple of times, what should we do? Do we tell them? Do we call their doctor? Do we call their mom? Do we tweet their followers? Which seems sort of invasive. and it's a little creepy, right, to have an automated system calling you and saying, hi, I think you're depressed, are you on your meds, or whatever. I've been thinking about this option of opt-in. So there's this very popular sort of movement towards quantified self right now, with everybody having Fitbits and tracking everything on Daily Mile or other fitness apps. And so because I'm a nerd, of course, I absolutely want to like hand my Twitter stream over and be like, yes, tell me if I'm depressed, tell me if I'm bipolar, I want to know. And then, of course, I'm going to immediately start messing with it, right?
I think we should just hand over our calendars.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's that information too, right? And then it starts being a little, again, it's creepy, right? Like, do you really want somebody reading your calendar? Right. Some people care and some don't. And so I like this notion of opt-in. So I've been thinking about that for a while. As you're already probably aware, have a special place in my heart for Alzheimer's. But these are not people who are tweeting, shockingly. But we've been thinking about maybe their loved ones maybe are. And so maybe we can tell that somebody says, my grandfather has Alzheimer's. Can we tell from that person's speech or talk about how their grandfather is doing, even if they're not actually talking about their grandfather in each tweet? Just don't do that. We had one of the researchers very interested in looking at eating disorders, which have an even greater stigma. You don't really see people saying that they've been diagnosed with bulimia or whatever, but you do see a lot of anonymous accounts that are clearly based on an eating disorder, and they all sort of follow each other, so they form these communities. So what information can we get at from a social network type of information, which we're totally ignoring here? And then we want to work with clinical diagnosticians. There was a workshop at the ACL this summer that was called Computational Linguistics and Clinical Psychology. And we had a couple of us presenting, including this last bit of work, to a couple of clinical psychologists that came down and talked with us and met with us and talked about how, what of that was interesting, what of that might be useful, what was dumb and we should just leave behind. So that was awesome. And again, we don't want to replace anybody. We just want to add sort of a near constant, non-invasive signal to the arsenal of diagnostic tools. So I have more questions than statements on this slide, but I think that starting to explore some of the ways in which we can answer these questions could really make a big difference and really impact our society. Do you have any questions?
Okay, we have some time for questions.
Do you have information on the demographics of the tweet data set?
Demographics on the tweet data set, like their age or their, good. I'm gonna go back to that slide. Great. So we had something like 1 in 6 tweets are geotagged. So we have, so that's how we did the study, was we looked at geotagged tweets. So I can just tell you where they are. I don't necessarily have, we didn't contact these people. Hi, I got your Twitter stream. No. We didn't look at their profiles. As I said, we didn't examine their social network at all. So mostly, no, we don't have their demographics. They were all probably English speakers because of the 75% tweets in English.
Can you guess the sex and age?
Okay, so we have a different line of work that does what we call author analytics, right? That tries to look at, we did run the gender detector, which is pretty good in English. And I unfortunately can't remember the results of that, but we didn't run any of the other analytics that we have, like for age or relationship status or anything like that. But I think that'd be interesting too.
Age detection is pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have
creepy. I'm very definitely female for my Twitter stream because, as it turns out, I use exclamation points ever, and I repeat letters. But I also learned that if you put a nose in your smiley, if you're writing out the emoticon, then you're likely to be over 35, and I'm 36. So I don't put a nose in my smiley to try and like fool it.
One more question.
Yeah.
So the Unigram language model performed the best, if I understood the graphs correctly.
Yes.
So is that similar to bag of words?
Yes, absolutely.
So do you know which kind of words were most predictive?
We went through and looked at it. We brought up sort of like and there was another paper at this workshop from ACL that did this better than us, actually, so I would refer to their work. But we looked at, for each of the groups of users, we made just like a word cloud, and you could see things that made a lot of sense. Where for anxiety, you were getting a lot of worry and stress words, and it wasn't very surprising. A lot of the sort of creative and misspellings fell away because they would be, they would only appear once or twice, and they were often not on content-bearing words. We didn't get, I want to say that just the act of having a repeated letter tended to indicate a positive emotion. And so some of that came out, so we'd do like yee or oh from the character language model, but that was about it.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some fascinating work here. I just had a question. For physicians, when patients communicate with them, I mean, most will not accept electronic mail because of HIPAA requirements and so forth, and most of the communications are by phone, if they're going to be anything at all. It seems this type of an analysis could be combined with something like looking at pause lengths as they're actually determined in vocal streams, or something along the lines of voice stress analysis, if you wanted to put that in the background.
Absolutely.
So that you could do interviews with people who might be suspected of having early stage cognitive impairment by phone, as a way of just kind of touching base with your patients. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on how that might bear out.
I think that's a great idea. We hadn't looked into it because we had, for that particular study, the study had completed, so we couldn't go back and recommend that they do some other things. And that group as a whole has moved more towards analyzing autism and away from Alzheimer's. I could see that being a great idea. You get some extra stress. We looked at stress in the vocal signal and some at pitch, I think, when we were doing this original study. And it didn't indicate as much as basically just pause length did, which was sort of unfortunate because it was a lot harder to look at that stuff. But you get some extra stress already because patients are stressed out. They want to do well on these tests. There is that societal stigma of you don't want to be diagnosed as having dementia, but if you could normalize sort of across time, or maybe with a regular phone call, it would be less stressful because you're not going in, or you could suppress. Yeah, there's a lot of things to take into account, but I think that'd be a great idea.
Yeah. It sort of looked like low-hanging fruit. I guess my other question had to deal with, what do you think about other modalities for detecting dementia, like movement-based and like? I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, it happens that I met somebody over lunch who was looking into this. So I absolutely think that there is a lot more information that we haven't gone after at all, that we've really been driven by the data that we had. We were just starting to build up sort of a smart home scenario at OHSU, and a couple people were trying to look at sleep patterns based on bed measures. how much the bed was moving. And so that was starting to be really telling too. And I absolutely think it's vital to include as much information as we can because I think it's really complementary.
Yeah, especially when many of these other measures you can only gather back once every 6 months.
Yep.
Practice effects.
Yeah, absolutely. We did. I'll repeat the question or the statement. A lot of these things you can only gather every 6 months or so. If you get things like movement, it's harder to get practice effects. We did hear a lot about practice effects, particularly with the narrative recall and then the category fluency. So people would practice like naming animals or naming vegetables to try and make sure that they don't have dementia, which I'm not sure if that helps them retain, flexibility and staves off dementia, or just fools the test for a day.
I'm just going to ask one question and hand it to Micah. And Bill asked the multimodality question. Thanks. I didn't plant him. Actually, I did. All right. So you talked about for the entire talk the binary question of whether somebody has X or does not have X. And so I'm interested, obviously, with TBI, traumatic brain injury, or with ALS, you have a progression, either improving or degenerating. And so I'm actually interested in the degree, not so much the yes/no question. And I was wondering if you had thought about that.
So we've thought a lot about the temporal aspect. We don't have so much the notion of, that might not be true with depression. We didn't try and capture it anyways because we just had the diagnosed with X tweets. But and I don't even have this in my hidden slides, so you know. But we graphed the last 5 tweets from a user in a sliding window, and how sort of high each of those tweets were scoring on like a depression. Like, is this set of tweets depressed? Is this set of tweets depressed? And you could watch people sort of peak and come down. We were doing it for the SAD to try and find it based on seasons, and weren't seeing it at all. We had a wider average there too. But we did, and that's how we know that we're pretty sure that we had a bipolar user and a number of depressed users in our control group, because you could watch them. We had the division, and you could watch these just spike out of the random group and then come back down. So definitely, yeah, looking at a temporal aspect of degrading over time, or degree or cycling. Yeah, SAD's a good example of that. Micah.
I actually want to follow up on Bill's comment and your comments on practice effects. It seems that the things like pause length and really linguistic complexity are giving you independent measures for cognitive impairment over the standard diagnostics, and those would be unlikely to be affected by practice effects. So you could look at whether or not, especially for early stage and mild cognitive impairment, whether you can actually get improvement in cognitive abilities by practice, or is it really just the effect of invalidating the instrument?
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? Yeah, if we could, we could determine whether Lumosity was doing its job, right? I took this test last month for dementia, I guess. So again, with the opt-in notion, right, of saying, I want to be tested for this. I sort of want to opt in my mother. This is why Alzheimer's is a special thing to me. I love her. Oh, that just got recorded. And she won't watch it, it's okay. Yeah, so I mean, if we could show that practicing something like that did help versus not just fooling the machine, my God, that would be amazing. Or if we could show that it's not, then just relax. Don't worry about it. Don't practice. It's fine.
You can talk to the editor. Any other?
had a similar question, but maybe you've answered it. I was wondering also about looking at the data longitudinally, the cathartic effect of using tweets. Did you look at anything like that?
We started thinking about it really just in the last month, I think, where I probably can't get back to the slide in time, but we had a couple of examples where somebody had said that they were diagnosed, but they've been healthy for 2 years, or they've been seeing a therapist, or we started looking at, can we separate users into sort of recovered, recovering, new, what that would even look like.
Or the role that engaging
Absolutely.
in the social media
Absolutely.
plays in
And that comes
healing,
up on,
using the word very loosely, but
yeah, absolutely. That comes up also pretty strongly in the eating disorders. That's actually what motivated it, was we saw that there are groups of people that would sort of just spiral down together, but we weren't sure, like we just had this sense that they were spiraling down. You could sort of watch the tweets go back and forth faster and faster between everybody in the group, versus people who, obviously were not talking to anybody in that type of area, had, removed themselves. They were recovering. They, were willing to help, were willing to talk about it, but like only to a point.
Well, let's thank our speaker.
Thanks for coming.